Humiliation, pressures, and whispers in the corridors of Wall Street. James Miller, a junior analyst, feels the weight of his boss's absolute power. But numbers, always precise, start to tell a story that no one wanted to hear. And as he investigates, the truth threatens to shake structures that seemed untouchable. Edward Hayes's lips curled in disdain. Standing tall at 1.9 meters, the managing director of Harrington and Wells Capital pointed to the projection screen with an accusing finger. "Is this what you call analysis, Miller? A first-year student would do better." James Miller, 28 years old, felt the blood freeze in his veins. The conference room on the 43rd floor, with its panoramic view of the city, suddenly seemed too small. 15 senior executives were watching him, some with uncomfortable expressions, others with a subtle pleasure in his humiliation. "Sir, the numbers are correct. I've triple-checked every calculation and—" "The numbers might be correct, but your interpretation is childish," Edward interrupted, banging on the mahogany table. "This report on renewable energy derivatives completely ignores the macroeconomic implications of rising interest rates in Europe. It's almost as if you're deliberately trying to lead the committee to a misguided conclusion." James took a deep breath, trying to steady the tremor in his hands. 3 weeks of sleepless nights, hundreds of spreadsheets analyzed, and now this. "Allow me to show the alternative models that—" "Enough," Edward abruptly closed James's laptop. "This meeting is over. The committee will use the projections from Stephenson's team. Miller, reorganize your numbers by Monday or consider your career options." As the room emptied, James remained still, rearranging his papers with trembling fingers. Margaret Collins, a senior VP in her 50s, briefly stopped by his side. "Don't take it personally," she murmured. "Hayes does this to all the newcomers." But James knew it was more than that. The numbers didn't lie. Something was wrong with Stephenson's projections. Very wrong. The small apartment in Queens that James called home reflected his methodical personality. Organized shelves housed technical books, black and white photographs, and a single photo frame with the image of a smiling couple, his parents, George and Martha Miller. James opened the nearly empty fridge, grabbed a beer, and loosened the expensive tie he had bought with his first bonus. The TV murmured financial news at a low volume while he looked out at the city through the window. The glow of the skyscrapers contrasted with the simplicity of his apartment, a constant reminder of the distance he still needed to traverse. On the coffee table, an old, yellowed newspaper clipping. "Accountant and wife die in car accident." 18 years had passed since that rainy night when, at 10 years old, he was awakened by social workers. "Your parents had an accident," they said. What they didn't explain was why his father's car, meticulous in everything, especially maintenance, would have skidded on a wet road and fallen off a cliff. James picked up the old calculator that had belonged to his father, an HP 12C model that seemed ancient among modern smartphones. It was his talisman, his only tangible legacy besides the memories. "Numbers don't lie, Jamie. People lie. Numbers tell the truth to those who know how to listen to them." His father's voice echoed in his memory as his fingers caressed the worn keys. He opened the laptop and began to work. If Hayes wanted rearranged numbers, he would have them. But first, James needed to understand why his boss was so determined to dismiss his analysis. "You look like a zombie," commented Alina Rodriguez the next morning, placing a coffee on James's desk. At 26 years old, with intelligent eyes and a soft accent that revealed her Colombian origins, Alina worked in the compliance department and frequently exchanged ideas with James. "Thanks," he muttered, taking a sip of the strong coffee. "I spent the night reviewing Stephenson's reports." And James looked around to make sure no one was listening. "There's something strange. The return projections for the high-yield funds managed by Hayes are consistently 3% above the market, even in sectors that are declining." While reviewing Stephenson's reports, James noticed an old footnote mentioning Continental Investments. A chill ran down his spine when he recognized the name of Edward Hayes among the listed executives, even though he was only in his 20s at the time. Something about that connection seemed familiar but impossible to fully grasp at that moment. Alina frowned. "Maybe he's just good at what he does. No wonder he makes $20 million a year." "No one is that good," James whispered. It's like he knows something that nobody else knows." "Be careful, James," Alina warned. "People who ask questions about Hayes tend to find their desks cleared out." "I just want to understand the numbers," he replied, massaging his temples. "My father always said—" "Your father was an accountant, right?" Alina asked softly. James nodded, surprised. How did you know? You mentioned it once, said he taught you to love numbers. She smiled. He would be proud of you. The conversation was interrupted when James's phone vibrated, a message from Margaret Collins. My office now. Margaret's office had the understated elegance that comes with decades of success on Wall Street. Unlike the ostentatious spaces of other executives, its walls displayed diplomas and a single photograph of Margaret climbing Mount Kilimanjaro. Sit down, James, she indicated a chair. How are you after yesterday? Surviving, he replied cautiously. Margaret studied him for a moment. You know, I've seen many brilliant young people get destroyed by Edward Hayes. It's almost a rite of passage around here. James remained silent, uncertain about the purpose of the conversation. What do you see when you look at Hayes? She asked abruptly. The question caught him off guard. A successful leader who has built an impeccable reputation over 40 years, he replied diplomatically. Margaret laughed, a humorless sound. Good answer. Safe. She leaned forward. Now tell me what you really see. James hesitated, then decided to take a chance. I see inconsistencies in the numbers, impossible returns, correlations that don't make sense. A glint of approval appeared in Margaret's eyes. Go on, the energy derivatives I've analyzed. Stephenson's team is projecting returns that would only be possible if they had prior knowledge of regulatory changes. James paused. It's as if they're operating with insider information. Margaret nodded slowly. And what do you intend to do about it? What can I do? Hayes is untouchable. No one is untouchable, James. Margaret stood up. I have a meeting now, but remember, watch closely what's right in front of you. Sometimes the answer is hidden in plain sight. In the weeks that followed, James developed a routine. During the day, he performed his normal duties, following Hayes's guidance to review his models. At night, he turned his apartment into an investigation bunker, meticulously analyzing every transaction signed by Edward Hayes over the past 5 years. The pattern began to emerge: offshore funds in Cayman, transfers to phantom subsidiaries, consulting contracts with exorbitant values for companies without employees or physical offices. It was sophisticated, almost impossible to detect without specifically looking for anomalies. One night, while researching Hayes's early career, James found something that made his heart stop. An old photograph from the local financial newspaper showed the Continental Investments team in 1995. In the front row, smiling discreetly, was his father, George Miller. And in the back, partially obscured, was a young Edward Hayes. James felt the air escape from his lungs. His father had worked with Hayes. The coincidence seemed impossible. With trembling fingers, he searched for more information about Continental Investments. The company had abruptly closed in 2000 after unspecified accounting fraud scandals. Months later, his parents died in the accident. The pieces began to fit together in a disturbing way. His father, always obsessed with the truth in numbers, had probably discovered irregularities, and weeks later he was dead. The phone rang, startling him. Still awake, Alina's voice came from the other side. How did you know? Because it's 2 in the morning and you just sent yourself an email with the subject Continental Investments, check contracts. She paused. James, what's going on? As a compliance analyst, Alina could discreetly monitor access and transmission of sensitive files within the company. It wasn't guesswork, just professional observation. He hesitated, then decided to trust her. I need to show you something. Can I come by your place tomorrow after work? Of course, but James, be careful. The walls have ears at Harrington and Wells. Alina's apartment in Brooklyn was cozy and vibrant, with colorful walls and shelves full of books in Spanish and English. She served wine while James spread documents across the dining table. This is insane, she murmured, examining the evidence. Are you suggesting that Hayes has been running a fraud scheme for decades and that possibly had something to do with your parents' death? I know it sounds crazy, James admitted. But the numbers don't lie. Alina held his hand. James, even if you're right, this is dangerous. Hayes has connections all over Wall Street, in the SEC, in Washington. I can't let this go, Alina. His voice trembled. For 18 years I've wondered if there was more to that accident. I can't ignore this. Then don't do it alone, she said softly. Let me help. That night something changed between them. The investigation that had begun as professional revenge became a quest for justice, shared by 2 people who found in each other more than allies. The following days brought an invisible escalation of retaliation. James's files began disappearing from the system. Meetings were rescheduled without notice. Formerly friendly colleagues started avoiding him in the hallways. "He knows," James whispered to Elena in the empty elevator. "How could he know?" she asked, worried. "I don't know, but he knows I'm investigating." The confirmation came in the form of an email from the Human Resources Department. Mandatory meeting 3 p.m. subject: professional conduct. The HR room was sterile and impersonal. Barbara Jenkins, the Human Resources Director, had a serious expression as she placed a folder on the table. "Mr. Miller, we have received concerning reports about your behavior in recent weeks. Unauthorized access to confidential files, use of company resources for personal investigations, paranoid behavior with colleagues." James turned pale. "That's not true. We have evidence, Mr. Miller." She slid a paper. "This is a detailed report of your activities, including personal searches on our servers about Continental Investments and Edward Hayes." Elena hesitated before sending the report. She knew James trusted her, but the compliance department's rules were clear. Any findings involving an executive of high rank had to be reported. She promised herself that she would help James in every way possible, but she couldn't ignore corporate policy. The final blow came when Barbara turned the report so he could see the signature: Elena Rodriguez, compliance analyst. "Elena reported your activities 2 weeks ago," Barbara continued. "Given your previous excellent record, we are willing to offer a generous severance package instead of dismissal for cause." James left the office stunned, betrayed, and defeated. Not only had Hayes won, but the one person he trusted had turned him in. 3 days later, James was in his apartment packing belongings. The severance package would ensure his survival for a few months, but his career on Wall Street was effectively over. A knock on the door interrupted his gloomy thoughts. Upon opening it, he found Margaret Collins. "May I come in?" she asked. Confused, James stepped aside. Margaret surveyed the stacked boxes and nodded as if confirming something. "You were fired," she stated. "Technically, I accepted a voluntary exit package," he replied bitterly. "After Elena betrayed him, it wasn't a question." James averted his gaze. "Why are you here, Mrs. Collins?" Margaret took an envelope from her pocket and placed it on the table. "Because it's time for you to know the whole truth." The envelope contained a letter dated 2000, signed by George Miller. It was addressed to the Board of Continental Investments, detailing an accounting fraud scheme and specifically naming Edward Hayes as the chief architect. James held the envelope with trembling hands. It was as if his father's voice was there, guiding him, just as it had always guided his passion for numbers and the truth. Every line written was a reminder that justice could be pursued, even decades later. "Where did you get this?" James asked, barely able to breathe. "Your father sent me a copy days before he died," Margaret replied softly. "I was a junior auditor at Continental. He wanted to ensure that the truth survived in case anything happened to him." "And you did nothing?" Anger began to bubble up in James. "I tried," Margaret sighed, "but without your father the evidence was circumstantial. Hayes had already risen, backed by powerful executives. Continental closed and everyone moved on." "Everyone except my parents," James said bitterly. "I spent 20 years preparing for this moment, James, building power, influence, gathering evidence. And then you appeared, the spitting image of your father, with the same determination for the truth. And Elena, did she really betray me?" The door opened and Elena entered. "Not exactly." In the days leading up to the meeting, James and Margaret worked in silence, reviewing every document, every email, every contract. Small adjustments, double checks, and strategic recordings ensured that nothing could be contested. Every detail was a silent preparation for the moment when they would finally face Hayes and the board. The Harrington and Wells Capital boardroom was a monument to corporate power. Dark wood, Italian leather, impressive views of the city. Edward Hayes entered confidently, greeting the board members with familiarity cultivated over decades. His smile faltered when he saw James Miller sitting beside Margaret Collins. "What does this mean?" he asked the board chairman. "Please have a seat, Edward," the chairman responded coolly. "This extraordinary meeting has been called to discuss some disturbing findings." For 2 hours, James methodically presented evidence of systematic fraud. Forged contracts, shell companies, bribes disguised as consulting fees. Hayes's face fluctuated between anger, disbelief, and, finally, a calculated calm. "Impressive, Miller," he said when James finished. An elaborate conspiracy based on coincidences and the misinterpretation of complex financial practices. Do you really think this board will believe the theories of a junior analyst with an obvious personal grudge against me? We are not here because of James's accusations, Margaret intervened. We are here because Alina Rodriguez, who has been working for me for 3 years embedded in compliance, has independently verified and confirmed each allegation. Hayes visibly paled. You can't. And there's more, Margaret continued, gesturing to an IT technician who activated the audio system. Hayes's voice filled the room. If Miller keeps snooping around, he might need to learn the same lesson as his father. Accidents happen to people who ask too many questions. The silence that followed was absolute. That was recorded in your office last week, Margaret explained to the astonished board. After James had been removed, we believed Edward would lower his guard. Hayes stood up abruptly, knocking over the chair. This is unacceptable. Illegal recordings, unfounded accusations. The SEC already has all the evidence, the board chairman interrupted. As does the FBI. It's over, Edward. 6 months later, James adjusted his tie while observing the city from his new office on the 43rd floor. The sign on the door read, James Miller, Director of Compliance and Risk Analysis. A soft knock on the door announced Alina, now his official partner in the department and in life. Ready for the meeting? He smiled, but his eyes revealed the complexity of his feelings. Hayes' downfall had been spectacular, but the ramifications had been greater than expected. Dozens of people lost their jobs when the scheme was exposed, many of them innocent, just pawns in Hayes' game. You know, James said as they walked down the hallway, my father would say that winning is not the same as doing the right thing. And what would you say? Alina asked. That integrity is not a destination, it's a journey. Each day brings new choices. In the conference room, Margaret was waiting for them with a new folder of documents. We found discrepancies in the Asian division. It seems that not all of Hayes' friends have been exposed. James picked up the folder, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility. The numbers told a story as always, and he would continue to listen. Let's get to work, he said, opening the first page.